Story number 1. John carefully observed his mother-in-law, whom he had admired for a long time. He pondered how to make the first step to express his feelings. In the end, he decided to wait for the right opportunity. Coincidentally, it was on this particular day that his wife urged him to visit his mother-in-law and ask if she needed anything. John didn't have to be persuaded for long, and he quickly left, slamming the door behind him. As he headed toward his mother-in-law's house, he pondered the best way to start the conversation. Should he be assertive? But that might lead to an unfavorable response. However, he figured she would be pleased since the young man had shown interest in her. Still, he was worried about the possible repercussions if she took offense or started yelling, or worse, if she reported it to her daughter. Once on the doorstep and ringing the doorbell, he hesitated. Suddenly, he heard quick footsteps approaching from the other side of the door. "Who's there?" warily asked his mother-in-law, who was always wary of burglars. John replied that it was his son-in-law, and a moment later the lock clicked and the door opened. "Well, come in," she said. When he looked at her, he was completely stunned. The sight of her sheer negligee made his throat dry. Her underwear was clearly visible, showing off her breasts. His son-in-law couldn't help but admire her gorgeous figure, and he wondered what she was like in bed. His own wife had long ago protested to him, tired to the point where he couldn't find the words. Why did I marry her? He only thought badly of her. She's mean, jealous, and doesn't look after herself. Eats too much and only sits around the TV. Unlike her, his mother-in-law had a slender figure and perfectly manicured nails, painted with red nail polish. Each nail resembled a piece of candy. Even though he didn't like sweets, he was drawn to her manicured fingers with shiny nails. It was almost an obsession. When his mother-in-law called him into the kitchen, he obediently followed her, furtively peering at her backside. He couldn't help but think how beautiful she was, and even longed to touch her. When his mother-in-law suddenly turned around, he thought she was reading his intolerable thoughts. It was as if she knew exactly what he was thinking. John looked confused. "Why did you come here?" she inquired, taking a seat at the table. Her negligee was half open at that moment. John thought about how a woman's legs were the last to age. First the face, and then everything else. His mother-in-law, however, seemed to defy that rule. Her appearance was flawless and would have been the envy of any young woman. Her skin was as fresh as a girl's, with a soft pink hue and peach fuzz on her cheekbones. John explained that he had come on his wife's errand to make sure everything was okay and to check on her. The mother-in-law smiled enigmatically, showing off her beautiful teeth. Her full lips, painted with bright lipstick, were tantalizing. John was confused, struggling to keep the conversation going. "Please have a seat." "I'll make some tea," she offered, gesturing to the table. "Thank you." John watched her graceful movements in the kitchen. Sandra moved easily and unhurriedly. Handing him the cup, Sandra leaned over. The neckline exposed firm, seductive breasts with no signs of aging. John was almost stunned by what he saw. He felt a rush of dizziness, but managed to pull himself together. He mentally scolded himself for acting like an immature guy. Worried. Like he hadn't seen enough of this in his life. Seen enough of this John in his life. He was unfaithful to his wife for quite some time. Not often, but regularly. He knows how to charm women. However, in his relationship with his mother-in-law, he was faced with a dilemma. He had no experience in this situation. He didn't know where to start. He didn't know how to proceed. Should he say, "I have feelings for you. I can't resist. Can I kiss you now?" Or should he refrain from direct words, but only subtle hints? John tried to determine the appropriate course of action, squirming in his seat. He couldn't even taste the tea, black or green, with or without sugar, cold or hot. John didn't know that Sandra was plagued by the same doubts. How to make the first move. She put on lipstick, especially for him when she saw her son-in-law from the window. She chose a bright red shade. She thought it would make it more obvious to him that she was a lonely woman craving male affection. However, she didn't want to hurt her daughter. She wore a negligee for him, as well as lacy lingerie from a famous brand bought at a discounted price. She put a lot of effort into it, but to no avail. She stares at him intently and blinks slowly, resembling a statue. "I'm fine. Thanks for asking," she said sincerely, sliding her foot over his leg. A shiver ran down John's spine. What graceful legs my mother-in-law has. They could do a can-can dance, it's true. Her ankles are slender, her calves strong, her knees rounded, and her skin is as smooth as a young girl's. Her mother-in-law grinned, realizing John was fascinated by her legs. Almost involuntarily, she shifted the position of her legs, exposing her thigh. Smooth and flawless, without a single dimple or wrinkle. John gritted his teeth, struggling to contain himself. He wanted to pounce on her and rip off those extra pieces of fabric. She'd be surprised. When would he finally get down to business? I could feel my mother-in-law's impatience growing. I was at a loss as to how to entice him. Maybe I should try getting naked or something. John took a deep breath, trying to keep his hands to himself. His heart was pounding frantically in his throat. His thoughts were a mess. What should he do? His whole being was screaming, demanding an answer. "I'm stuffy. Open the window, son-in-law," she asked in a weak voice. John quickly got up from his chair and reached to open the window. Sandra came up behind him. He felt her warm breath and smelled her fragrant perfume. Without thinking, he abruptly turned around and pulled her to him, showering her with passionate kisses. Sandra pulled away at first, but soon gave in, responding with equal fervor. His wish to become a son-in-law had come true. Sandra proved to be a tough nut to crack, but she couldn't resist him. John felt joy. One less problem to worry about. He no longer had to look for new life partners. Sandra was always there for him, and being retired, she rarely left the house except for groceries. That was a stroke of luck. Sandra expressed the same opinion. If she got bored, she could turn to her son-in-law and ask him to help with repairs. And she would always find something that needed fixing. After all, he is not a fool and will quickly figure out what needs to be done. His wife remained unconcerned about everything. When she inquired how her mother was doing, she got an answer. Her mother is doing well. There is no need to worry. Indeed, the mother-in-law was currently in good health. She expressed a desire to change the wallpaper and asked me to find time to help her. John lied convincingly. His wife nodded in agreement. As for me, I certainly don't have time to help you. I have work to do. John pretended to reluctantly agree and rubbed his hands together. However, he decided that they would come up with another plan. For example, they could paint the floors or whitewash the ceiling, combining pleasure and practicality. It would make her happy and give him pleasure. Besides, it would be a double benefit for his mother-in-law. Renovations and my presence. Left alone, my mother-in-law began trying on lingerie. For an hour, she fidgeted in front of the mirror, scrutinizing herself. Satisfied with what she saw, she thought about what to wear to impress her son-in-law next time. Black stockings and a scarlet lingerie set. She decided, winking slyly at herself in the reflection. And high heels. That's where he'd go crazy. He's always staring at her feet. She planned to dance for him and light some candles. They'll have a wonderful time together. The most important thing is that they understand each other. With that thought, she lay on the bed, visualizing her son-in-law in every detail. Story number 2. The beginning of my story dates back to when I was 24 years old and my wife was only 19. I wouldn't call her a stunning beauty, but I couldn't deny her charm either. After we were married, we lived together for a few months until I moved to San Diego. In the meantime, My wife stayed home and we occasionally saw each other on weekends, about twice a month. Each time I returned to my wife's house, the entire household rejoiced at my arrival. It is worth noting that my wife lived with her parents. On one delightful visit, I stayed for a whole week, and since my wife was a student, she had to go to the university, leaving me alone at home. Seizing the opportunity, I decided to surprise her by going to the bathroom. Turning on the water, I settled myself in the tub, letting the warm water envelope me. However, when it was time to get out, I heard the sound of the front door opening and decided it was my wife coming in. As I continued to soap my hair, I was stunned when the bathroom door swung open, revealing none other than my mother-in-law. We looked at each other and couldn't say anything. The silence lasted about 5 seconds. Then my mother-in-law came out. She worked nearby and often came home for lunch. Let me describe my mother-in-law to you. I wouldn't call her fat, but I wouldn't call her thin either. She was 44 years old, a woman in the prime of her life. When she came out of the shower, she apologized again for catching me in such a state. I assured her that everything was fine and it was my own fault for not closing the door. Subsequently, my mother-in-law and I were engaged in conversation and sitting down to dinner when my wife entered the room. So we refrained from telling her about the incident and maintained a calm demeanor. After dinner, my mother-in-law left for work and I told my wife to take a shower. In the evening, we gathered as a family for dinner. During the meal, we had a few drinks, and afterward I settled down in the spacious living room and watched TV. It happened to be my parents' room. Meanwhile, my wife was settled in her room, painting and studying. My father-in-law was napping in the kitchen where the couch was, and my mother-in-law retired to her room. She changed into pajamas and settled down next to me to watch TV. Gradually, the effects of the alcohol began to take effect, and my mother-in-law rested her head on my shoulder. After a while, she turned slightly and nestled her lips against mine. It was probably the strongest kiss of my life, considering she was 20 years older than me. However, she wasn't just any woman, she was my mother-in-law. We quickly covered for each other, and from that moment on, our relationship began. The next day, when everyone had gone about their business, my mother-in-law arrived early for lunch, and we continued our affair. Obviously, this situation is completely inappropriate, but unfortunately, that's how it played out. Story number 3. After the death of her husband, my mother-in-law was experiencing great difficulties. For 6 months, she was in constant depression and nervous breakdowns. Before this tragic event, despite her 44 years of age, she looked young and attractive. However, as she neglected to take care of herself, her appearance quickly began to reflect the age on her passport. Watching this transformation was very painful for me. I confess that when I first met Maria, my imagination was captivated by her attractiveness. Her symmetrical facial features and voluptuous figure were certainly pleasing to the eye. She also had a penchant for wearing revealing and provocative outfits, which couldn't help but delight. There were even moments when I was discreetly admiring her. However, everything changed in an instant, and now she wore only dull and careless clothes, not to mention the fact that she did not pay attention to hair, makeup, and other care. Maria had no one closer to her than my wife and I, and it was our responsibility to lift her spirits and restore her vitality. We had to take the initiative and make every effort to rejuvenate my mother-in-law. We just need to introduce her to a respectable gentleman to get her interested in him and start grooming herself. The idea occurred to me. "You're a genius, Frank," my wife exclaimed. "That makes sense. But what man would want to date such an unattractive woman with faded looks?" "Well, let's try a different approach," I suggested. "Take her to a beauty parlor, get her hair done, manicures, and anything else she needs. And you're going to give her money for all that? It's not cheap, is it?" "Yes, I love my mother-in-law, and I don't want her to suffer," I replied. After some thought, I made a decision. When Jennifer told me the approximate cost of caring for my mother-in-law, I was stunned, to say the least. My entire premium had gone toward this endeavor. Feeling a little disappointed, I still nodded in agreement because I had to keep my word. I couldn't understand how my wife had managed to convince Maria to go to the beauty parlor. But the most important thing was that it had happened. Sitting at work, I could only sadly watch significant amounts of money fly out of the account. Apparently, my wife and mother-in-law underwent one after another various procedures. However, as it turned out, it was worth it. When I arrived at my mother-in-law's house, I didn't even recognize her. Instead of the usual simple woman, a captivating mature beauty looked at me with passionate eyes. Jennifer and I had already agreed that I would shower my mother-in-law with compliments, but now I didn't even have to think of anything. My rapturous praise poured into her ears, and for the first time in my life, I saw a person blush with embarrassment right before my eyes. An amazing event took place, and we successfully lifted my mother-in-law's spirits. She continued to blossom with each passing hour, and as we said goodbye to her, we did so with a heavy heart. Saying goodbye to a woman who had rediscovered her vitality was bittersweet, but we also needed time to recuperate and enjoy the solitude. The next day, I was stunned to see a missed call on my phone from Maria. "Frank, hi. Your help yesterday meant a lot to me. Thank you so much. I'd like to meet again today." "Maria, I'd love to do that too. However, today and tomorrow are work days, so it will be a little difficult for my wife and I to get out. If you need anything at the store, I can stop by later in the evening and help you out." "That sounds great. To be honest, it was you alone that I was looking forward to seeing." Maria's cryptic words left me puzzled, but I refrained from inquiring further over the phone. Although her request for help with physical matters made sense, I couldn't understand why she wanted to see me without my wife. The answer was waiting for me at my mother-in-law's house. When I saw her, I was even more stunned. Maria greeted me in a rather short skirt that barely reached her knees and a light blouse boldly unbuttoned across her chest. "Maria, you look amazing. Are you going on a date?" I asked immediately. "No, Frank. It was your words and compliments last night that prompted me to experiment with my appearance. I wanted to know if you were just flattering me yesterday, or if you really like the way I look." "Maria, of course I was sincere. However, I must admit that yesterday you just looked attractive. Today you look incredibly glamorous and bold." "Thank you, Frank. Your words are really kind. But why are we lingering in the hallway? At least let me buy you something tasty." My mother-in-law has perked up. She prepared 3 dishes just to please me. She fiddled around in the kitchen, setting the table and arranging the food on plates. The woman reached for the top shelves of the cabinets, stretching out in front of me like a cat, as if trying to draw my attention away from her figure. It was then that I finally realized that my mother-in-law was making an effort to capture my attention. It looked very spectacular, but also very strange and unusual. In spite of my desire to reciprocate, I was bound by marriage to her daughter. Noticing my bewilderment, she seemed to enjoy it. Just before parting, she came up to me and, before kissing me on the cheek, said bluntly, "Frank, I'm going crazy. I need someone." Her blatant innuendo left me confused. All I could do was nod in agreement, promising to call her the next day. I hurried away, trying to calm my racing heart. I never expected such words to come out of my own mother-in-law's mouth. The most disturbing part was that I was eager for it myself. As a responsible family man, I felt obliged to tell my wife everything. I had always been faithful to her, and the thought of having any kind of relationship with my mother-in-law would be a serious betrayal in her eyes. Jennifer immediately went out onto the balcony, and her anxious mood was reflected in me as well. I decided to leave her alone, letting her gather her thoughts in solitude. When she returned, she made her unusual request. "I know this may seem strange, but I want you to grant her wish. We have put so much effort into helping her overcome her depression." I knew I had to react accordingly, so I smiled and assured her, "You're not weird, you just care a lot about your mother." The next day, I pleased Maria by confirming my arrival at 8 p.m. As I approached the appointed time, my excitement grew, for I had never before imagined such a development, even in my wildest dreams. But now it was going to happen in the real world. The woman met me in an even shorter skirt and a transparent blouse. If I didn't know Maria, I might have assumed I had come home to a slutty girl, but my mother-in-law was nothing like that. She was aware of her attractiveness and knew how to flaunt the virtues of her body. "Would you like some dinner?" she asked, winking at me, clearly having prepared something special. My movements must have resembled those of an inexperienced teenager. We didn't need to exchange unnecessary words. However, I didn't expect my mother-in-law to be so energetic. After it was over and we were catching our breath from the excitement, we felt no discomfort or remorse. Rising from the bed and heading for the kitchen, mother-in-law said, "Now we'll have dinner without any bickering. But don't think of relaxing, because we'll definitely be back in the bedroom later." My wife, who allowed me to visit her mother and relieve her of her depression, had no idea what her mother was capable of. Nor could we have realized what wild side we had awakened in her. However, I realized one thing: it would take more than one night, and I would have to work hard to keep my mother-in-law from becoming depressed again.